All right, hello, people. This is the Tokugawa Japan lecture, going with chapter 27 in your Traditions and Encounters textbook. So again, we're going to be talking about Japan. It's not really pink. All right, first we're going to begin with the shogun. Military leaders, known as shoguns, ruled Japan in the emperor's name from the 1100s through the 1400s. But the landed aristocrats, who were called Daimyo, would fight and attack each other with their little armies made of samurai, their own private armies, much like the aristocrats in medieval Europe. They had absolute power over their territories, and they just threw the country into chaos. Eventually, people would struggle to unite the country. And one of the main tools they're going to use is gunpowder. So gunpowder weapons helped a series of powerful daimyo to gradually unite Japan. The first was a guy named Oda Nobunaga. There he is. He used gunpowder muskets that he had purchased from Portuguese traders, and he had unified almost 1/3 of the entire island before he was assassinated in 1582. Goodbye, Oda. Next, Toyotomi Hideyoshi, who nearly conquered the entire island, maybe because he had a horse that looked like a dragon, before he died in 1598. Now, when he died, he didn't actually rule all that long, and his intention was to leave his conquered lands to his son, assuming that his trusted friends and the people around him would sort of take care of the country and, allow his son to inherit, seeing that his son was only 5 years old. However, one of his right-hand guys, Tokugawa Ieyasu, declares himself the shogun, and after a pretty wicked battle, he actually is the one who comes out on top. His successors would rule Japan into the 19th century, and this time period would become known as the period of great peace. There he is, Tokugawa. See, it's so peaceful he can just sit and chill. All right, take a listen.
In September 1598, Toyotomi Hideyoshi, the man who brought an end to more than 100 years of civil war in Japan, died in his sleep at age 62. He had hoped to pass on his ruling position to his 5-year-old son, trusting that his top aides would shelter the boy until he came of age. It was not to be. Hideyoshi's right-hand man, Tokugawa Ieyasu, wanted the power for himself. He amassed an army of 74,000 followers and led it against a force of 80,000 Toyotomi loyalists. The two armies clashed at a strategic crossroads called Sekigahara on October 21st, 1600. At the start of the battle, the Toyotomi warriors were already in place. Tokugawa Ieyasu advanced his samurai against them under the cover of early morning fog. As opposing groups of warriors blundered into one another, skirmishing broke out along the lines. Initially, the element of surprise gave the Tokugawa forces an advantage. But as the fog lifted and fighting intensified, momentum shifted against them. It looked as though Tokugawa Ieyasu might go down in defeat. Then, just in the nick of time, he saved himself with an adept political move.
What shows Ieyasu's brilliance at Sekigahara is not that he brings more men to the field, but that he subverts the unity of the opposite side.
Ieyasu sent agents to coax the commander of a sizable portion of the enemy force to change sides. It worked, and the Toyotomi forces were overwhelmed. It was an epic battle in samurai history. Tokugawa Ieyasu was now the undisputed military leader of Japan. Unlike his predecessor, he had every intention of claiming the venerated title of shogun. Tradition, of course, required that he be of Minamoto clan descent to qualify. He wasn't, but he devised a way to circumvent that annoying technicality.
Tokugawa Ieyasu had to present to the emperors a falsified genealogy in order to prove that he was a descendant of the Minamoto. And of course, this was known to the imperial family, but it was a kind of a pro forma thing. And so once a fairly convincing document was presented to them, they could close an eye on whether it was absolutely historically accurate.
Ieyasu assumed the office of shogun with great fanfare in 1603. He set up his shogunate, his military government, in Edo, modern-day Tokyo, and peace soon settled over the land. It was a peace Ieyasu would enforce with an iron fist. A key to this enforcement amounted to a sort of formalized system of hostage-taking, a practice long in use by powerful daimyo to help maintain domestic tranquility.
It wasn't uncommon for daimyo, in order to cement an alliance amongst each other, to exchange relatives. And you'd have some very odd ones, like sending your mother to stay with a new ally, just to show that even though we've met on the battlefield before, I'm not going to attack you. You send me a daughter, you send me a son, I'll send you a daughter, I'll send you my mother, and you'd exchange relatives, really to show that you were committed to not fighting each other, to remaining allies.
Ieyasu's system required all daimyo to maintain a residence near the shogunal headquarters in Edo. He demanded that they live there much of the time.
They're allowed to maintain a castle in their homeland, and they're allowed to maintain that home base. But every other year, they need to travel to Edo and live in a villa, which can be rather lavish, but can't be particularly well fortified. In fact, it's supposed to be a non-military residence in the shadow of Edo Castle, Tokugawa Ieyasu's castle, and they live there roughly half the time, because they travel there, they live there for a period of maybe 10 months, then they travel back.
But while a daimyo was away visiting his property, his family members had to remain in Edo. As an added measure of control, the new shogun's government closely monitored travel. These conditions made it virtually impossible for regional lords to clandestinely join together, muster armies, and rise in revolt. Eventually, the new shogun even all but sealed Japan's borders to keep out rebellious influences from abroad. Most Japanese could not travel to other countries, and only a few select foreigners could visit Japan or establish trading posts on the islands.
He divided his enemies so brilliantly that by the time he dies, the Tokugawa regime is this solid dynasty that lasts over 250 years.
All right, a little bit more information for you there. All right, so the Tokugawa Shogunate sets about sort of reorganizing the government of Japan and centralizing control over what was originally sort of a feudal system. Japan at the time was divided up into about 250 territories, each of which is controlled by the daimyo and were independent, and Tokugawa was like, no, none of that. And like the video just said, he required that you actually sort of leave your family nearby, within reach, so that he could get to them if he needed to. This takes those daimyo and pushes them down to being sort of more landlord kind of thing that manages the territory rather than independent autocrats, little autocrats of their own area. All right, so what did this do to society? Well, as the civil wars ended, the samurai as a class were no longer needed. You didn't need your own private army, and you kind of couldn't even have one. Some of the unemployed samurai, known as ronin, would roam around the countryside, and some even became bandits and thieves, robbing people. Ronin is like a term for a samurai with no master. The government tried to push the samurai into becoming bureaucrats, and that didn't really pay as well as being a samurai did, and a lot of samurai didn't feel that it was really fitting for their class. Even though many of them declined in stature and were less important and less necessary, they still remained at the top of the social pyramid, kind of just below the emperor and the shogun. And below them were actually, interestingly enough, were peasants and farmers, with artisans and merchants below them. Japan was influenced by Confucian ideals as well, and people viewed the merchants and artisans were actually profiting off of the work of others, sort of like a parasite. You didn't make that thing, you're just selling that thing. That farmer grew that cabbage, or that other person made that silk, and you're just selling it. So that was sort of a lesser job. And the very bottom of the rung of society was held by the Eta, which was a group that did the jobs which were considered unclean, things like butchers, executioners, anybody who dealt with the dead, etc. The Eta as a class is very comparable to the untouchables in India. They were ostracized and had to live in specific areas. And the whole class itself was tightly regulated by the government in Japan. And the Edo wouldn't be emancipated until 1871. Here would be a good place to pause and read this, but I'm not going to sit here silently while you do so. All right, arts and literature. Okay, during the very prosperous Tokugawa Shogunate, art and literature really flourished. Wealthy merchants and daimyo would build lavish homes and, of course, would demand beautiful things in them. This is actually Edo Castle in Tokyo. And they demanded suitable entertainment. Some of the decorative pieces of art were made with what's called woodblock prints. Here's a very famous one. This is made by pressing a block of wood into ink and pressing it into either the paper or the silk. The haiku form of poetry was elevated to an art form. This is one of the famous haiku poets, Basho. The whole point of a haiku is it is short, it is to the point, but it is evocative. It brings up an image. And when you say it, you see it. And of course, there was also Kabuki theater, which we have discussed in class. This appealed to a wide audience, and sometimes the performances would last for days. Now, if you can actually sit in a theater for 2 days as opposed to going to work, then you're probably pretty secure financially. Fiction actually flourished as well, particularly with the wealthy, non-aristocratic merchant class, which shows the rising literacy of Japan. One of the most popular was by actually a female, Ihara Saikaku, who wrote 5 Women Who Loved Love, which was at the time considered a collection of very racy, naughty stories. So what about foreigners? In the beginning, European traders were welcomed into Japan, including Christian missionaries. However, some of the new Japanese converts to Christianity were not so tolerant of their old native religions and sort of rampaged and even destroyed some Buddhist shrines. In response, the shogun banned Christianity and Christian worship in 1587, and missionaries were themselves kicked out of Japan. By the 1630s, nearly all foreigners had been kicked out of Japan, and foreign books were not allowed. And the Japanese were essentially shutting themselves in. They were closing the door a lot like China. So I hope you at least listened. I hope you wrote something down. I hope something sticks in your little gray matter between your ears, because this is definitely something you're going to need to know for the exam. And I will see you later. Peace out.